No, just between. We'll do it like 10 minutes. Two by twos. Look at that. Oh, there's 4. Okay. 2 by 2s. Where ever heard that before? All right. That concludes our talk. Thank you for. No dessert left. Yeah. So we'll begin. So tonight this lecture we're going to talk about the flood of Noah's day, and. The Bible declares Noah's flood as one of the most significant historical and theologically important events that occurred on the earth since creation. As a historical event, it had forever erased the original antediluvian world that existed before the flood. In that world, there was the Garden of Eden. Humans lived to an average of 900 years. Animals were much larger than they are today, including beavers up to 1.5 meters tall. And dragonflies with meter-long wingspans. Dinosaurs and incredible creatures roamed the land, skies, and seas. Evidence of their existence is known from what we find in the fossils. However, that world is long gone. Why? Because as the Bible tells us, mankind had become so wicked that God was grieved he had made mankind. As creatures made in the image of God, we have the capacity of doing wonderful things. Yet we, humans, chose, instead of life of sin, evil, depravity, and violence, to such an extent that God was grieved that he had made us. How corrupt we had become. The wrath of God was poured out on mankind, and all but 8 people perished from the face of the earth. So we're going to investigate that remarkable and awesome event. The question that people are asking is, was the world ever completely covered in water? And if so, why is that important? What evidence do we see that the world was indeed covered in water? And some of these are the natural evidences that you will see from the global flood. Put out by one organization, it said this: the scientific and historical evidence is now clear. There never has been a global flood that covered the entire earth, nor do all modern animals and humans descend from the passengers of a single vessel. You would think this was from a secular or atheist organization. No, in fact, this is from Biologos, the organization, the ostensibly Christian organization that wants to help you believe that the Bible is untrue and that evolution is true. In fact, what Biologos is actually saying is that Jesus was wrong about the flood, and Peter, who also talked about the flood, was also wrong about the flood. In fact, Dr. Francis Collins, who founded Biologos, and the Anglican scholar N.T. Wright actually created a video during the pandemic in which they praised evolution to a Beatles song. This obviously was, kind of ironic. These guys were trying to uphold the Christianity and while doing so, destroying the foundation of it at the meantime. It's rather ironic because the scientific community themselves have said, now we don't agree with the timeline, but they says 1.5 billion year old Earth had water everywhere, but not one continent, studies suggest. In fact, they say what they'll even said, excuse me, is there's much more water entrained in the rock under the crust than there is above the crust of the earth. It's in it's like some wood. I forget the name of the wood, the stone, right? So scientists themselves are saying, yes, the world at one time was covered completely in water, and yet Christians are saying it never was completely covered in water. In this case, I have to agree with the scientist who, in other words, anyway, it gets rather confusing as who's telling the truth here, right? It's also rather ironic because on Mars, they have uncovered evidence of flooding. An article by Scientific American, NASA's Perseverance rover finds evident signs of epic ancient floods on Mars. And yet there's no water on Mars. And yet there are signs, which we can tell, indicative of flooding. And these same signs are on the earth, which some people say is indicative of no flooding. And the world is 70% covered in water. I'm getting confused. Are you as to... All right. There are many diverse opinions on the flood, but there's only one opinion that really matters. And what did God say? That is the question we have to ask. If you look at the book of Genesis, now this is all the books of the Bible in a timeline from about 4000 BC to when the Bible was, finally the book of Revelation was written. As you can see, the book of Genesis covers the longest time period in the entire Bible, over 2,500 years. More than half of the biblical account is covered in the book of Genesis. So Genesis obviously is a major part of the Bible. And we need to take careful reading of what it says. Lifespan before the flood. As you can see here, the lifespan of Adam, he lived 930 years, and Seth, 912. The average was about 900 years. Methuselah was the oldest of 969. You'll notice that he died just before the flood, which happened about 1,656 years after creation, according to the biblical accounts. So he didn't get on the ark because he died before. I guess he didn't have any energy left at 969 to do all that, spend a whole year on the ark. Okay, but you'll notice that Noah, well, I was going to show you this. Adam and Noah were only separated by 2 generations. If you look here, you see Adam 930. I'll just back up so you can see who it is. Okay, Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah here lives, several hundred years, and then Noah. So it's very easy for Adam to talk with Methuselah or Lamech, who would have then talked to Noah. So there's only actually 2 generations separating Adam from Noah. And I guess when you have 900 years of life, you got a lot of stories to tell. Adam, tell us that story again about creation. How do you think Adam got that story about creation? It wasn't written down. How did he think he got it? He was at the end of this process. How did he know what happened before him? Well, the Bible tells us that Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden. They talked with God. So one of the things Adam would have said, how come I don't have a belly button? What's a belly button? God asked. Anyway, so where did we come from? And then God would have told him. That's the only way that Noah or that Adam would have known is if God had told him. Okay? And then, of course, to pass it on. So there's only 2 generations between Adam and Noah. And if we continue to look at the lifespans, you'll see that the lifespans are very, very long and consistent over 900 years. But then after the flood, now Noah himself lived until 950 years, so he lived about 400 years after the flood. It's hard to see, it's 448 here. Okay, Shem, of course, lived through the flood for another 600, a total of 600 years. But you can see the lifespan is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, till about Joseph's 110 years. Why? Why was that? Some people say, well, the environment here before the flood was radically different than it is today, which is probably true because you had, as I mentioned, the beavers and the dragonflies, which are much larger than they are today. But it's not because of the environment so much, but because of genetics. Okay, because Adam and Eve would have had perfect genes, so there would have been no mutations at all. However, there's a population bottleneck under Noah. We are all descended from one family, from Noah's family. And so the genetic mistakes, the mutations would have started to accumulate in the human population, reducing our lifespan. Till now, of course, about 80, 90, 100 years is roughly what it is. Okay, so that's probably what caused it, is the genetic problem. You'll also notice that here, Noah died just 4 years before Abraham was born. And his son Shem was alive with Abraham for 149 years. Excuse me. So obviously, Abraham and Shem, if they actually met each other, could have told exactly what happened during the flood. Again, how the transmission of the story of the flood would have gone from Noah to Shem to Abraham, who would have passed it on to further eventually being recorded by Moses. All right. Okay. What evidence is there for flood? Well, that's the question. Why was the flood needed? Of course, you remember the biblical account that God saw how the wickedness of man was great on the earth, Genesis 6-5, chapter 6, verses 5-8, how it had become so bad that God's heart was grieved. I find this one of the most saddest verses in the Scripture, where God had created man, his crowning glory, and yet it had become so corrupted that God said, I only have one choice left, and that is destroy them all. How bad had humanity become that God himself was grieved, indicating the emotion of God. God has feelings, and we can grieve God as humans had done. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Out of all the possible billions of people who lived, it was only Noah who found favor in the eyes of God. So that's why it needed the ark, the saving of Noah and his family. What about the size of the ark? The size of the ark was a massive vessel. Now, it was huge, you can see here, actually about the similar dimensions to some of the super tankers. In fact, they're almost of the same color. Right? Isn't that amazing? But one of the things you'll notice that this super tanker has a curved bow, but the Noah's Ark did not. Why? Because it wasn't going anywhere. It was just floating. Right? It didn't have to break the waves. It was just a vessel that was meant to be stable during the flooding event. The waters rose, the flood rose, not going anywhere. There's no port to go to. It was just floating along, and wherever the waves took it. Now you can imagine that this wasn't just a gentle bathtub. It was major tsunamis coming in and flooding the earth and the continents until eventually so this would have been very, very rough water. And the studies on the ark have shown that this shape of vessel, extremely stable even in the most turbulent seas. 60-foot waves or 50-foot waves. Some of those super tankers I wouldn't want to be on it, but they survived during that weather. If any of you have been to the Ark Encounter, you'll notice that this ark is indeed a massive creature, the largest wooden man-made structure in the United States. It is huge. This is the ramp on the outside where the animals would have gone in 2 by 2, and it goes up to a door which leads into the ark. Huge. If you ever have an opportunity, highly recommended going to see that. This is a massive boat. What about the animals on the ark? Many people have said, how could you possibly fit the millions of animals that needed to go on the ark? Okay, well, let's ask the question, what animals needed to go on the ark? Well, God had told Noah, listen, you're going to bring animals, 1 pair of land-dwelling, air-breathing animals and birds. And you're going to bring 7 pairs of clean animals. So a total of about 16,000 animals. How do you get 16,000 animals? Well, first of all, you didn't have to take any of the creatures in the water, in the oceans. You didn't have to bring any whales on the boat. Didn't have to bring any fish. They're already in the water. They're going to stay in the water. All right? You didn't have to bring insects. Somehow those mosquitoes got on there anyway. Okay. So he had to bring land-breeding animals, and birds on the ark. How many? Well, according to calculations done by John Woodworth Rapp, who did a Noah's Ark feasibility study, we have some here, which is also the basis for a lot of the answers in Genesis, Ark Encounter, looked at every aspect of the ark. Heat, light, waste disposal, food consumption, hibernation, all these aspects of it. The guy did an awful lot of work. It's about 1 inch thick and goes on there. Only about 1/3 of the space of the ark was actually needed for animals. Well, how many animals need to get on the ark? Let's give you an idea. 747, they don't longer build them anymore, but it was a huge ark, huge creature, reads 300 cubits or 450 feet long, 44 feet high, 75 feet wide. It was a massive ark. If you put in railway cars, over 500, these type of railway cars could have fit onto the ark. 500, that's amazing. Some of those super tankers can carry 11,000, or transport 11,000 of these cask containers on some of those ships. Right? So massive. So if you put 240 sheep on each of those cars, you could have fit 124,800 sheep on the ark. But that they would be happy, but they would still get a lot of sheep on it. Okay. All right. Well, what about the dinosaurs? Dinosaurs. I mean, some of these creatures got to be 100 feet in length. I mean, as long as this church is wide. All right. So how are you going to fit them? It's a good question. Well, these are adults. If you were going to bring an animal on the ark, why bring an adult? Bring a little one. In fact, the largest dinosaur egg is about this big. They started out as eggs this big and got to be monsters. Okay? So with the power of PowerPoint, look at that. I can shrink that dinosaur to a manageable size. Here we have a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I just get a little wee one, okay, before it goes through its growth spurt. Actually, that's what they believe. Experts believe that dinosaurs, for the first 5 years or so, remained relatively small, and then they started going through a growth spurt, where they're eating massive amounts of food and increasing in mass, huge, to get the size that they were when they died. So, again, still, how many animals? How do you account for all those animals? Well, how about dogs, for example? How many dogs did Noah, or God, bring to Noah on the ark? How many would he need to be? Well, that's a good question. There's dogs in my neighborhood that yap, that bark. There's one that barks at 1 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m., 7 a.m. It should have gone on the ark, or not gone on the ark. But, so both creationists and evolutionists believe that there was an original canine kind, original wolf or dog kind, possibly a gray wolf, from which all the other varieties descended. In other words, within the original created wolf kind, all the varieties, all the genetic code for all the varieties of dogs were in there. Even some of those little mutants they have at the bottom there, you keep them in their purse or something. These aren't dogs. I'm sorry, it's not real. Anyway, so instead of bringing in all the varieties of dogs, just bring in a pair of the original archetype, original kind of dog. And therefore, as they, through natural selection, you're going to have all the different varieties, and through human intervention. A lot of these dogs that we have today are human creations. They're not natural dogs. Okay? All right, so you only had to bring a couple of dogs, a couple of cats, from which all the various cats would come from, and et cetera, et cetera. So he didn't need all that number of animals to greatly reduce the number. It also tells us that the Bible tells us that the flood was universal. In other words, it was global, covered the entire earth. Okay? In fact, that's what God said. For the Lord God says, I will wipe out from the face of the earth the human race I've created, along with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I have made them. So it was meant to be a universal judgment for everything that was on the surface of the earth. And excuse me, it was also a type of the judgment to come. It was an object lesson to what the wrath of God, as a warning to people of what God can do, and in fact, what God will do. When you look at the book of Revelations and what the judgments that are to come, they are awesome and terrifying. And yet we know that this is what God has done in the past. So we have warning about what God will do in the future. And that's why he says, as it was in the day of Noah, so shall it be in the day of coming the Son of Man. This is serious business. That's why one of the reasons why Jesus used that as a warning. It's going to be a terrible time of disaster. Make sure that it doesn't capture you. Make sure you're on the ark. And for Christians, that is in Christ. If you are in Christ, you are like in the ark. You will be saved. If you're not in Christ, you're not going to be saved. And a lot of people became believers on that day, but it was too late. Now, of course, they believe that the flood was coming. Yes, we believe you now, Noah. Let us in, let us in. We're dying out here. What about my baby? And Noah said, for 80 years or more, I've been telling you, warning you about this. You all laughed. And I can't do anything now because God himself has locked the door. I couldn't open it even if I wanted to. Very sober reminder of what's going to, as that's what Jesus said, so will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. There'll be a lot of believers when the end time comes, but it will be too late. Also tells us that the Bible tells us that the waters would be above the mountains. In fact, it tells us that the waters would be over about 22 feet or 15 cubits above the highest mountain. Well, how's the water going to go over the highest mountains? I asked my family for a Bible encyclopedia. NIV Bible Encyclopedia, 5 volumes. Okay, so I'll go depth. I look in the section of the flood. Now, the people who write encyclopedias are probably very smart, well-educated people. Probably went to Bible college, seminaries. So this particular guy says he agreed that the flood had universally, across history, been agreed to that it was a global flood. It covered all the earth. But he didn't think so. He thought the flood was only in the Black Sea area, Ukraine, that area over there. That's all it was over there. But it wasn't global. It was only in that region. Because he says, well, what about Mount Everest? Mount Everest is 29,000, about 13,000 meters high. He says, how are you going to get the water to cover that? Well, he said, you'd have to have 7 times the volume of water that exists now. How is it possible to go over to Mount Everest? It's impossible. And he would be right, except he was wrong. So first of all, a local flood will never cover a mountain. It'll always go around the mountains, right? It's never going to cover a mountain. So it can never be a local flood. Excuse me, I got a tickle in my throat. And what do we know about Mount Everest? Anybody climb Mount Everest? Okay. Within 200 feet of the top of Mount Everest, there are marine fossils. In other words, fossils of things that lived in the sea, which means at one time the top of Mount Everest was 200 feet above sea level. That's what that means. So it shows that yellow band there. This is from the University of Montana State University. It says that the top of Mount Everest is composed of fossil-bearing marine limestone. So when this Bible commentator he was thinking that the Mount Everest was there before the flood came. And then he would be right. Then he said there wouldn't be enough water to cover. How is it possible to go over Mount Everest? Rather than Mount Everest is a result of the global flood. It was Mount Everest, as we'll see in a minute, it was the movements of the plates that collided with each other that caused the push up. So the Mount Everest is a result of the flood, not there before the flood. Now, he could have known that if he just did a little bit of research in creation.com, typed in Mount Everest, and he would have explained it all there. But he didn't. He just said, well, these creationists don't know what they're talking about, but I do. Well, he obviously doesn't. Interesting, Dr. Hugh Ross, also a Christian apologist who touches this issue, in Christian Post in 2019, did the flood of Noah cover the entire earth? Hugh Ross on what the Bible says. Now, he's going to explain what the Bible says. Ross, a proponent of old earth creationism, argued against the claims of young earth creationists that the flood covered the entire earth. Well, that's not our claim, that's the biblical claim. Anyway, the most explicit text about the flood, he said, come from Job, Psalms, and Proverbs. Really? Genesis isn't very explicit? Anyway, the phrase of the entire face of the earth needs to be understood in the context of the observer, he emphasizes. So what the observer observed was when he saw the flooding of the local flood, he thought, oh, this must have covered the entire earth. Or the entire earth was only what I could see. Except that this is not man's word. It is God's word. It's not from man's perspective. It's from God's perspective. God knew what he's going to do. When non-Christians discover the Bible does not teach that the flood waters cover the whole earth, they are more open to considering its claims as a serious, inerrant document. Ross exclaimed, what? The Bible tells us that there was a global flood, but you, Ross, says if you can explain that there wasn't a global flood, you are more likely to believe the Bible. Why, yeah, okay. Reasonably takes the view the first 11 chapters are indeed history, just not that really what occurred, right? that they were in fact actual events, except not the way they were presented in the Bible. Is it very confusing? Absolutely. Okay. And Dr. U. Ross, I put the caption there, sorry, Jesus, but the flood did not wipe out all life on earth. We know how to interpret the Bible. You are mistaken. Which is essentially what they're doing. They're saying that Jesus didn't know what he was talking about. What about duration of the flood? Well, the Bible tells the duration of the flood was started on the 600th year of Noah's life, and second month, 17th day, very specific, and it ended on the 601st year, second month, 27th day of Noah's life. Very specific, which means there's a details that somebody has put into, or God has put into the Bible, that we should be aware of. 1 year and 10 days. And so what happened? Has God's promises been broken? One of the questions we need to ask. When you see the rainbow, the first mention of the rainbow is in Genesis. It tells us, right, there are other rainbows, but this is the real one, okay, the first one. It says, I will establish my covenant with you, said God to Noah. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. So God sets his rainbow in the sky as a sign so that, Noah, whenever you see this rainbow in the sky, let this remind you that I'm never going to again send a flood over the whole earth. But if the flood, as you Ross would say, was a local flood, has there been local floods? There's been a gazillion local floods. So if God, in fact, meant that the flood was a local flood, then every time you see the rainbow, you can, according to you, Ross, understand that God was lying. Because there has been so many. God said there never will be a flood like this again, and yet all the time there's flood like this. So either God is lying, or you, Ross, and others are. One or the other. Also, Bible tells us that all people descended from Noah's family. In fact, we have allusion to that. For example, Mizraim, Noah's grandson, is the Hebrew word for Egypt. In fact, Mizra is Arabic for Egypt. Ana Mizra. That means I'm Egyptian. Ashkenaz, you may have heard of Ashkenazi Jews. Those are Jews who come out of Germany. Okay, Ashkenaz. Canaan is the region later recalled Palestine. Javan is a Hebrew word, also from this event, for Greece. Cush, Old Ethiopia. So all of these are, and Meshech is the ancient name for Moscow. So all of these are, now the names have changed slightly, but you see that these are all the dispersal of the nations after the flood, and particularly after the Tower of Babel, where the language was changed and dispersed all over. Okay? The New Testament speaks of the flood as global. We already covered that. Luke 17:27 says, the flood came and destroyed them all. And Peter says, God did not spare the ancient world, for the Greek word is cosmos, but preserved Noah, preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. So all the ungodly around the world were affected by this global flood. What would a global flood do? We already talked something about that in the previous talk. But it would rewrite ancient history, basically erase everything and start again. And you would, of course, have erosion and deposition. You'd have, of course, a lot of water is going to move a lot of dirt, and we're going to see some evidence of that, and bury plants and animals on a global scale, which will, what we call paleontology, ancient life, we're going to be looking at that. So denying a global flood, will lead to a misrepresentation of data in ancient history, geology, and paleontology. And let me tell you, in modern science, there are 2 things that are not permitted in modern science. One is supernatural. Everything must be explained by natural processes. So there cannot be any intelligent design. There cannot be any supernatural events of any kind. They are excluded a priori, right from the beginning. So if you do a scientific report or paper espousing some kind of supernatural agency, you'll be not accepted right off the get-go. God is not allowed. Second thing is a global flood is not allowed either. Why? Because a global flood will greatly accelerate all the processes that are believed to have taken a long, long period of time. Okay, we'll touch on that in a minute. So those two things, supernatural events and the global flood. That is why it is denied so strongly. Many people said, there never was a global flood. They're adamant about that because it's not permitted. Right? Evidence that human population in ancient nations began about 4,000 years ago. We already talked about the previous lecture about human population. Fits in well with this global time period. Sedimentary rock shows evidence for rapid deposition. We showed that on that very rapid creation of all the layering and large-scale features. Evidence of rapid recent burial, even buried alive, and a general pattern with exception. So, flood legends. Human History Recounts, the Institute of Creation Research did a survey of tribes and nations which had flood legends. About 200 of them have in their history some measure. You can see along the top, whether it be Assyrio-Babylonia, Persia, Syria, etc., China, etc., Cree, indigenous people have them in their legend as well, and various aspects about that. Most of them all have, you see the one, destruction by water. All of them have this destruction by water element. Some have the ark is provided. Some have humans are saved. Most have humans saved. Animals saved, a few. Universal destruction, almost all of them. So you can see that, of course, if you have the original story, eventually it's going to get corrupted and diluted over time, unless it is preserved in writing, which is what we have in the Bible. So you can say that other tribes, where would they get those legends from? Well, they would get them from, of course, the Bible, and over time they would dissipate. We have also the dispersal of the nations. We talked about that earlier. Okay, all started from the Ararat region near Turkey and Armenia, that area there. That's where the Ararat mountain is, where the flood landed. And this table of nations in Genesis 10 talks about how the nations were dispersed after the flood. Question also of languages. Languages are, in evolutionary term, somewhere, a long time ago, some creatures decided they're issuing grunts and whatever, and eventually that evolved into our modern languages. But that's not what the Bible tells us. The Bible tells us that although there obviously was some language before at creation, and there might be some diversification, at the flood, it came down to just the language of Noah and his family, probably some form of Hebrew. But at the Tower of Babel, as you recall the story, God had confused the languages so that now all of a sudden they couldn't talk to one another. And that's why they dispersed all over the nation. So therefore you would have not only different languages, but different structures of languages, such as Chinese, Arabic. All of these are not just different languages. The whole structure of language is different. Even in Egypt, when I was there, they have hieroglyphics. Only very few people can actually read it, and it's not reading the way we think of reading. It's by sounds. So you look at it and you interpret the sounds, and then you can figure out what it is. I don't understand it, but total different structure of language, which would make sense of total different structures of languages, families of languages make sense. It fits in with the dispersion at Babel. Okay, sedimentary rocks. Well, we talked about sedimentary rocks before. In Utah, anybody been down to Monument Valley? Okay. I think this is Navajo country, but you'll see these monuments. They look like they have been pushed up from out of the earth. You see a whole series of them all over the place, but they're not. You'll notice that there are we drove around there, and there's very distinct patterns in these layers. You'll see one here, for example, very thick layer, and then a whole bunch of very thin layers. And if you look at the other monuments, they exhibit exactly the same pattern. All the modern monuments have the same patterns, indicating they were all part of one big field. But you will notice, of course, that there's a whole lot of nothing in between. Right? There's a whole lot of nothing here. Where did it go? Well, some people might think, well, the river would have taken it away. There's no river there. It's the desert. How do you remove all this material here if there's no river to take it out very, very slowly over a long period of time? Well, evidence suggests that this was taken away very rapidly by floodwaters. So as you can imagine, when the flood covered the whole earth, and some of the continents went down and others went up, making, of course, the ocean floor and the continents rise up, it would have captured a whole lot of water as the continents go up, sort of cupping this water in the continent. And in the middle of the United States, and probably parts of Canada, you would have had vast amounts of water. Well, if you have a rupture in that, this sitting well above sea level, it's going to try to find its way to the ocean. So if you have a rupture anywhere in the earth, such as in the Grand Canyon, what would have happened is it would have tried to find its way through the Grand, and a lot of water at a very, very fast rate would have taken all of the stuff around, left these monuments there. Why these particular, we don't know. But it's taken them out and then diverted it all off towards the ocean or the Gulf of Mexico or something like that. That would account why all this material is missing. This same feature you find in other places in, for example, Monument Desert in Namibia, in Africa, South Africa. Same patterns, right? Monument. You also see this in Mount Roraima in South America. Same type of thing. Again, all this sedimentary rocks are there. Okay, indicating that something has moved an awful lot of dirt in a hurry away from those areas. Here's some other things that are very hard to explain by natural, very slow processes, and these are these curved rocks. This is in Namibia, so you have about 200 feet or more of solid rock that is bent 90 degrees. How do you bend the rock 90 degrees? How do you explain if I have one layer laid out, and the next year I have another little layer laid out? How do I explain this? Going 90 degrees. Do I say 1 year laid out at a 90 degree? Well, of course, that's ludicrous. So obviously, this must have all been there together while it was still not rock, in sort of a plasma, sort of a soft state, and through tectonic movements or plate movement, cause everything to bend up. Now, you obviously have to be moving a lot of rock and plates, which is exactly what would have happened in the flood. You would have had a lot of tectonic movement, a lot of crustal movements, etc. Okay. Here we see a catastrophic plate tectonics. I have a video of this, so we're going to see that you have subduction. What you actually have is, here's the mid-Atlantic ridge, or an ocean spreading ridge. We can actually, if you take all the water out of the ocean, you could find a Titanic and the other vessel that was destroyed under there. But you can see there is this ridge. It's a 25,000-mile stitching. It looks like stitching on a baseball. And it's caused by ocean spreading ridge. In other words, as the lava comes up through the middle, it's got to go somewhere, so it's going to spread to the left and through the right, which is going to cause all of this to move. It's going to be subducted under the continents that are already here. This one will go down, this part will come up, which is why you have, of course, the mountain ranges. Okay? So this is a Dr. John Baumgartner, and in Ohio in the middle of July, there's an international conference on creation, which I will go to, and he will be there talking about his catastrophic plate tectonics, which is actually becoming very mainstream. Here we have Science talking about this. Okay, as much as evidence of water deepest in the earth, that's where it talk about that water, 600 meters deep. But as you can see here, is the lava is moving up, and it's going through the spread. It's spreading underneath, and it's also spreading the continents apart. Okay, why you have not continental drift, but continental sprint, rather than very slow moving. It's going to be moving very, very fast. Here's a little video I compiled to show you kind of what's happening. So the fountains of the earth crust, the deep break up. You have earthquake, ruptures, faults, and volcanoes occur. Lava and superheated water sprays up. And of course, this is just a small scale. You can imagine a massive earth-wide scale. Here you have the spreading of the seafloor. Massive convection currents of magma occur. Okay. Again, this is not a creation. This is BBC making this stuff. As you can see, it's spreading, and it's part of it subducting, going down some of the very hot lava, which is cooler, and as it goes, the cooler lava goes down, and it creates these globules of cooler lava in the other. And you can see also what's happening is that as it's subductive, it's actually pushing on the plates that are above it, and it's going to cause a spring back. This creates tsunamis. If you remember the one in Southeast Asia and on Fukushima, it was only a very small movement of crustal movement Well, here we have the Japanese, which created massive tsunamis. So those are only very small amounts, but you can imagine a 1,000-mile-long rupture or flexing of the crust, moving all that water. Here you can see tsunamis are racing across. You can actually barely see the movement. Tsunamis are racing towards the continents, going to cover them. And what's happening to the continents? They're going to be moving apart. And as they come together, they're going to collide with one another. The India subcontinent here is going to crash against the Asia. And what's going to happen? You're going to have a buckling, right? You have a lot of energy and a lot of mass moving. And as they come together, they're going to cause the mountains. In fact, the Himalayas are still rising about a meter every 100 years or so. Okay? So you still have this movement. Now, right now, it's moving very, very slowly, thank goodness. But in those days, because of all that energy from the flood, what initiated it, we don't really know. But as you can see in that little video, it gives you some idea of what occurred. Well, time doesn't permit us to show it again. This is a model of the movements. So at one time, God had collected all the mass, the ground together, and during the flood event, it all separated into the continents we have now. Okay. Not as fast as this, but you get the idea. It's very, very quickly. Okay, so we're going to move along here. The other thing you expect to find is evidence of rapid burial. So when these tsunamis occur, when this earth floor spreads, you're going to move a lot of water and a lot of dirt. So what's the first thing that's going to be buried? It's going to be the creatures that live on the ocean floor. Okay, so all marine life, all fishes, or not all of them, but a whole bunch of fishes are going to be buried. And so this is what you see. You're going to see massive amounts of marine life that has been fossilized. Here's a picture of a fish in the process of eating a fish. It's happened so fast that it didn't have time to decay. You can actually see all the spine and the ribs and the fins, and the little fish didn't even have time to finish its meal. It was flash fossilized. Flash fossilized, which means that this was a very rapid, and they literally find these in the billions of fossils, especially in California, a place like that. It's a huge amount. Now, Charles Darwin himself said you should never be able to find a fossilized invertebrate. In other words, a creature which doesn't have bones, because he thought it took a long, long period of time in order to create a fossil. So you would never find a fossil of a squid or an octopus or a jellyfish. As you know, if a jellyfish goes on land, it's not too long before it's going to turn to mush. You ever watch along the ocean, see the jellyfish? Next day, it's unrecognizable. Well, guess what we find? We find fossils of jellyfish, which means that the fossilization must have happened extremely rapidly. And we already told you about the fossils of dinosaur bones. Dinosaur red blood cells, collagens, DNA markers, etc. All of these. This is in a hadrosaur. There's many, many more, not just a T-Rex, but as people are thinking, well, wait a minute, if I can find it in T-Rex, maybe I can find it in Triceratops horn. They actually have found hadrosaurs, all these other kind of dinosaurs. Now that people have thought, hey, it can actually, maybe it's possible, they start looking. They wouldn't have started to look otherwise because they thought, well, we never find it, right? Because it would have died off millions of years ago. So when we see this geological column, which is shown in textbook, which doesn't actually exist in real life, there's no place you can go to see all this stuff, right? But what you have actually happening is that this is a sequence of burial. Okay, again, we're starting from the middle of the ocean. Things are starting to be buried. So the things on the bottom of the ocean, creatures that live there, trilobites and sea creatures and things like that, would be buried first. And then as you move higher onto land, things near the coast, things then which would be unable to run away very fast are going to be buried. And of course, creatures that are able to fly, or like, for example, dinosaurs. They find dinosaur footprints all going in the same direction in the States. I forget exactly where it is. But dinosaur footprints, which means that it was very muddy. And of course, it had rained a lot, so the ground was muddy. Dinosaurs are walking. They're running away from the approaching floodwaters, which are getting higher and higher. But they're not going to be climbing the mountains. They're just panicking. They're just running away from that. And eventually, of course, the waters would bury them and they would die. Humans, however, where would humans go when there was flooding? You would always go to the highest. You go to the first, look, what's the highest thing here? And so the humans would have gone to the highest, which means that they wouldn't have been buried with all that debris so much as they would have died and floated and decayed and been eaten by the creatures in the sea. So you wouldn't have found many, many human remains, but the vast majority of fossils that are actually found are marine organisms. You go wherever you look and you find fossils of shellfish and ammonites and all that stuff. Vast majority of fossils are those. Very small plants are algae and plant, that should be plant, and vertebrates. Those are creatures with spines. Very small number of them would be fossilized, which fits in with the Noah's account. Okay, moving water would sort things aside. So my wife and I had gone to Antelope X Canyon. I'm on the right, my wife is on. Anyway, so it's a close-up of the strata that I mentioned. The very, very fine, they're called laminae or barbs, very, very fine strata, many, many feet, thousands of feet thick, this one, okay? And we showed you this already, I'm not going to show you that again, okay? That was great, okay? So that was how you get the layers, right? It was a catastrophic event, so we should observe exceptions to the general pattern. Evolution predicts a very orderly pattern, but if you have a flood, of course, it's going to be catastrophic. So one of the things that people have said, when you go into these museums, like Royal Tyrrell, you only see dinosaurs, okay? But you never see the creatures that lived along with the dinosaurs. So Dr. Carl Werner wrote this book on evolution of grand experiments, actually available on, excellent book, highly recommend it. Paleontologists have found 432 mammal species in the dinosaur layers. Almost as many as the number of dinosaur species. But where are these fossils? We visited 60 museums that did not see a single complete mammal skeleton from the dinosaur layers displayed at any of these museums. This is amazing. So basically what he's saying is that the museums are biasing their displays so that you think that the dinosaurs were lived by themselves, and that after the dinosaurs died 65 million years ago, then they arose the mammals, right? But in actual fact, what they've actually found is dinosaurs and mammals living together, which according to theory of evolution should not have happened that way. So all of this evolutionary stuff is just, it's imagination and ideology, not necessarily science, okay? So we have a few other things. Ice age triggered by the flood. A lot of people ask the question, well, what does the ice age fit in? So one of the things you're going to have happen, as all that heat from the lava, the magma coming up out of the earth, it's going to heat the ocean. Superheated water. It's going to make them very, very warm. What happens when you have a warm ocean? You're going to have a lot of evaporation, a lot of water into the atmosphere. What's going to happen to that heavily saturated water when it gets to the north and south poles? It's going to condense and come down as snow. And if you keep doing that, that's a lot of heat in the ocean has to be gotten away. You're going to keep building up mountains or piles and piles of snow and up on the north and south poles to kilometers thick. This is where the ice age occurred. You have the heating of the oceans, providing the evaporation, and of course you have a lot of the volcanic activity, which is going to shield the earth with the dust and debris, shielding it from the sun's heating. Okay, so you're going to have a lot of this, which is also going to create like an insulation layer, and it's going to cause a lot of the ice caps going to be built up, so much so that there are going to be glaciers which are moving down past here. Okay, and so this is how you would have happened. So. Summers would have been cooler, not as hotter. Ice age would lower ocean levels by 400 feet. Think about that. If I'm evaporating all this water out of the ocean and putting it on the piles of ice in the North and South Pole, that means the water level in the ocean is going to go down, which would mean that you could bridge the continent between Asia and Australia, between Alaska and Russia. You could have had bridged a lot of this, ocean bridges, allowing animals to migrate along until eventually, in fact, you even find remains of rhinoceroses in Britain. How are you going to get rhinoceros in Britain? Well, if there was a land bridge, you could go through the English Channel until the water level rose up enough, of course, it isolated it, and then the rhinoceroses died out. Temperatures started going back to normal, and the winters became longer and colder, and of course, they would not have been able to survive, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So this is kind of a map of post-Ice Age, what lowered and allowed land bridges, as you can see here. Land bridges all across between Australia, allowing animals to migrate to Australia. When the water level rose, they would then be cut off and isolating them and left to their own devices. Okay. In conclusion, if the flood is responsible for the fossil record, then the millions of years explanation is wrong. And that makes sense. How do you make a fossil? You bury it. How long does it take? It goes very, very fast. If you get the flood right, you'll get the age of the earth right. The flood aged the earth, right? It tells us about 4,500 years ago there was a global flood. And many other data would fit with a global flood if you allowed a global flood into the equation, which, as I mentioned, that the scientific community has excluded it from participating in the discussion. So they'll never come to a proper conclusion. It has to be millions of years because if you exclude it. So you can trust the Bible. And I mentioned already the Creation Magazine. If you haven't signed up, still time to do it. I'm just going to skip through some of this stuff here. Hang on. Mount St. Helens, I didn't talk about that, but it's also, there's a DVD on that, Mount St. Helens, showing you how the strata could have occurred due to Mount St. Helens. Excellent DVD. And there's also one on Genesis history by our organization. They also have an excellent video on Mount St. Helens. Highly recommended to get that as well. Okay, folks, that's it. Okay, I be done. Okay. Peruse the books. Save a piece of cake.